Hello and welcome to the Life in Recovery podcast, episode 92 with me, John Loxley. Thanks for joining me. Hope you're well out there. This episode of the podcast is with Tamar Medford, who is the host of the Beyond Recovery podcast. It's another podcast swap. It was a fantastic conversation and I hope you enjoy listening to myself and Tamar as much as I enjoyed speaking with her.
Welcome back. We are hanging out with John Loxley. How you doing, John?
Very well, thank you, Tamar. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you in person.
It is so great to have you on the show. So why don't you start off for my listeners that do not know you? What is it you do today? Just give yourself a quick introduction.
Yeah, okay. So I am the host of the Life in Recovery podcast, first and foremost. And as a result of that, I've written a number of books. I can class myself as an author now because I've got a book published, which is very nice to say. So my new book, All Is One, The Science and Spirituality of Consciousness, will be out in the stores in March 2022. And I'm also a life coach as well. Just got my life coaching certification and just started working with my first few clients.
Nice. I love what you do. We have very similar passions. Now, I always like to kind of look back because my story, I had a really great upbringing. I know that a lot of people think that in order to fall into drug and alcohol addiction, that you have to have a terrible traumatic upbringing. And that's true for a lot of people. But for me, that wasn't my story. So I always think it's kind of important to share that side of the story so many other people can relate. What was life like growing up for you?
Objectively speaking, from the outside looking in, life was pretty good for me as well, really. I did grow up in an alcoholic household, but my dad wasn't a violent drunk or anything like that. Kind of like my worst memories, really, of him being drunk were just him not being there, like being in bed unwell or sometimes coming in drunk, but never particularly like nasty or anything. It was more fun when he was drunk. I kind of remember it as. But one of the things that I know now that I didn't know then, and as I said to you before the podcast, me and my dad did a podcast about 6 months ago, and through him telling his story to me and through me kind of asking the right questions and saying and filling in the gaps for him. From my perspective, he was able to see that he abandoned me within the relationship, or that he wasn't there, emotionally. He was there physically, but he wasn't there kind of mentally and emotionally. And that is what affected me the most, I think. That's where we were talking about before the podcast started about emotional intelligence. And that is where I believe that my lack of emotional intelligence kind of came from and began, So despite having pretty much everything I ever wanted materially, I was an only child and spoiled rotten, basically. I wasn't happy. That's the thing. I never ever went to the doctors and said I was depressed. I never did that, even in my adult life. But I was depressed, and that was the thing. I was, I was living under that kind of grey cloud. And I don't know if you know anything about the UK, but I come from a place called Manchester, and Manchester, they call it the rainy city. So I just thought that I was miserable because I lived in the rainy city. But then when I moved from Manchester to Leeds to go to university, Leeds is a much brighter, sunnier place, and I was still depressed there. So obviously it had nothing to do with the weather. And when I moved from home to my hometown to Leeds, my drinking escalated, and I started using drugs as well. And the whole thing just escalated. Basically, it was, it went from, I suppose, the way I've always explained it is like the shackles were off. When you leave home, I always said to myself, because I felt controlled as well at home. You know, like I've got my mum is she's a very, very loving mother, but she's very anxious about me, especially. You know, she's like sick to death of worried to death, should I say, of me kind of like hurting myself or whatever. You know, typical mother, I suppose. But I think what she didn't realize was that because I felt she was quite controlling. I rebelled against that, and I just felt as though as soon as I left home, I was going to do whatever I wanted, you know, and that's what I did. So, yeah, the drinking ramped up. Drugs became a massive feature, but only I was never addicted to drugs. It was more I used drugs to enable me to drink more. And the reason why I was drinking, I believe, was because I was just trying to avoid my feelings, trying to mask them. And the ultimate thing about drinking is it takes you to oblivion, doesn't it? And oblivion was where I wanted to be, because in oblivion, you don't feel anything. I didn't know any of this. Obviously, I had no idea that this was what was going on. I just thought I was having a good time. But, you know, yes, I think it was always there in the back of my mind that maybe I was an alcoholic, simply because my dad was, by this time, I mean, my dad was in the fellowship when I was 10. So I just thought, you know, well, I saw there was a plaque at the side of his bed. He went to his first AA meeting, and then the next thing I kind of remember, and this could have been days, weeks, months afterwards, there was a plaque at the side of his bed, and it was a serenity prayer, praying hands. And my dad had gone from being out in the pub after work to going to these meetings every night, pretty much. And I just thought, he's turned religious, you know. He's turned religious, and he's gone. He's weak because he needs these people, and that was it really. I never really gave it any more consideration. And then I started drinking not long after he kind of joined the fellowship. And to cut a very long story short, because one thing I really don't like is drinkalogs. I'm not interested in how much somebody drank, what they drank, where they drank. What I'm interested in is why they drank, and the causes and conditions behind that. And what I'm also interested in is what's the solution to that problem. So the very long story, very short, is that it got worse and worse and worse to a point where I just couldn't do it anymore. And I was advised, really, I suppose, by my partner at the time to leave the country, and we ended up moving to Australia. And the most important part of my story really is that the morning after my last drink, so the night before we left for Australia, I got blasted, you know, and I woke up the next morning, I blacked out, and to this day I have no idea what happened that night. And I woke up the next morning, and I just knew that the game was over. I just was like, I'm done with this. And I walked to the bathroom to freshen up, and I overheard my partner and her sister having a conversation, and her sister said, "You hate it when it gets like that, don't you?" And she said, "Yeah, I do. I'm going to leave him if he doesn't stop." And that was my rock bottom at that point, because I desperately didn't want to be on my own, you know. And I went back into the bedroom, and I got down on my knees and I prayed, and it was the first time I'd ever said a really sincere, "Please help me, I can't do this anymore," you know. And I didn't believe in God at the time. I was just, that was the surrender, you know, the moment of surrender. And that was over 10 years ago, and I've never had a drink ever since. And, you know, it was, in hindsight, that was my spiritual awakening. And again, I didn't know any of this stuff. You know, I went to Australia, I spent a year out there, no fellowship, no recovery, just abstinent, you know. And I went from being on that pink cloud to homicidal and suicidal within the space of a year, which tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? You know, I wasn't drinking, I wasn't using drugs, I wasn't smoking, I was eating well, I was doing loads of exercise, but I wanted to kill myself, and I wanted to kill everybody around me. So that tells you that it's got nothing to do with the substance that you're using or the behavior that you're using to avoid those emotions, you know. And yeah, I rang my dad from Australia, and I said, "Look, you know, this is what's going on for me." And he said, "There's somewhere where you can go for that, son." And I knew he meant 12-step fellowships. And I thought, religion, weak people again, you know. And I was like, no, thank you. And you know, I can do this on my own. I'm strong, you know. And I wasn't, because, well, I was, conversely, because eventually I did pluck up the courage to go to my first meeting, and that was only when I got back to the UK after a year in Australia, and I had my emotional rock bottom at that point, which again tells you everything that you need to know. So my emotional rock bottom was, as I said, like two options: drink again or kill myself. And I chose the third option that presented itself, which was go to a meeting. So I went to a meeting, and it was the best decision that I've ever made in my life, without a shadow of a doubt. That was on the 5th of August 2010. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about the recovery aspect of it, but that's all I need to say really, is that that decision, going to that first meeting, changed my life forever.
Yeah, and congratulations. I mean, you mentioned the emotions, and we talked about that before the interview. Like you said, is, you know, we use substances because we have an inability to handle our emotions. And I remember my first year of recovery, because I did the same thing. When I drank for the first time, I fell in love, because I'm like, hey, I can be confident, I can be funny. I felt like it was a complete like out of body experience. But I remember in my first year of recovery, I cried more than I ever have my whole entire life. And I mean, we were talking about emotional intelligence, and even how, you know, when you've got almost a decade of recovery in you, you're still like, those emotions still hit you sometimes, and you realize, okay, there's a lot of work to do. And it is a lot of work, continuously work, like we talked about. But, you know, what was early recovery like for you?
Well, just to, you know, comment on what you just said there, you're never ever going to get emotional intelligence until you start looking at your emotions. And this is something that I've started to do really, really recently, because I was recognizing that I wasn't reacting. I was reacting to my emotions all the time, and I wasn't responding to them in a kind and compassionate way. And I still do, you know, to this day. But I'm now starting to gain a deeper level of emotional intelligence, because I'm consciously thinking about what emotion it is at the time that I'm feeling and that I'm expressing, and I'm also consciously thinking, well, what's the opposite to that emotion? So we were talking before the podcast about resentments. You know, it was revelatory to me to understand that contentment is the opposite of resentment. So whenever I get a resentment now, I start to think to myself, okay, I'm feeling resentful. I want to be content. I want to be happy. So how do I move towards that emotion? And, you know, the steps that I take are, first and foremost, turn it over to my higher power, say the serenity prayer. Second, speak to somebody, whether it's my partner or over the phone. And then third, do some writing about it, you know, and really kind of turn it over, do some more praying on it. So that's a process that I was taught in my early recovery. And I did it in my early recovery. You know, my level of serenity in my early recovery was unbelievable. You know, it was like, they call it the pink cloud for a reason, because you are flying high, aren't you? You are, if you really want recovery, you're doing everything that's being suggested. You know, I remember the Just for Today card. I had that in my pocket, and everywhere I went, you know, if things were starting to get on top of me, I'd get my Just for Today card out, and I'd read that, and I'd say the serenity prayer over and over. So it's no wonder I felt good, because that's what I was doing all the time. You know, 10 years down the line, I don't do that, you know, and that's what I've gone back to doing. That's what I've started to do. If I'm in a traffic jam now, and, you know, and I'm thinking to myself, bloody hell, I want to get home, you know, I've been stuck here for half an hour, effing this, effing that, you know, like my mind's screaming at everybody. I've got the road rage, you know, I'm giving daggers to everybody that's driving past me. I stop and I say the serenity prayer, and I think to myself, okay, what is the opposite of impatience? Gratitude. So let's be grateful. Let's be grateful that I've actually got half an hour to just sit and relax after a stressful day. And this is, you know, this is miracles. This is for me, you know, like, for somebody who was kind of going through life at 1,000,000 miles an hour and always wanting to, you know, achieve the next thing, to be able to slow down and sit back in my life and actually take stock of what's going on around me, it's unbelievable. So in answer to your question, early recovery was great. It was fantastic. Then I started doing the work, got a sponsor, got stuck into taking the steps, and what he helped me to realize also is, it talks about the Jekyll and Hyde character, doesn't it, in the book? And he said, actually, there's somebody local to me who might be listening to this podcast, and he says this all the time, which is very similar to what my sponsor told me. He says, it isn't that you're a Jekyll and Hyde character, it's just that when you drank alcohol, it made a sick mind go public. And I think that's a really, really good way of putting it, because I had a very, very sick mind and I didn't know it. And that sick mind was a result of me not being able to manage my emotions. My emotions were constantly bubbling up to the surface. My mind didn't know what to do with them or how to handle them or how to respond to them. And they were just coming out, sideways all the time. Put a drink on top of that and drugs on top of that, and you've just got this, Tasmanian devil, crazy, like aggressive. And my partner, my wife, my ex-wife, she said to me, she said, you're such a lovely guy without alcohol, but when you drink, you're like a monster. And that's not a very nice thing to hear, and even hearing that, I didn't stop drinking straight away. I still carried on for a few years after that. But once I'd kind of, taken the steps and was kind of deep into my recovery, going to plenty of meetings, a minimum of 3 meetings a week, which is what I've always continued to do. Helping not helping others, sharing in meetings, doing service. The problem was I didn't quite have the recovery that I thought that I had. And when that became very apparent was a couple of years into my recovery. My marriage ended. So that person that I'd been with throughout the whole of my drinking, we got married pretty much straight away when I came into recovery. And, obviously I started to change, and maybe it's fair to say we just didn't go on the journey together. But what happened, we grew apart basically, and it was more my doing than hers. And eventually, the kind of wheels came off and the marriage ended. And there was loads of guilt and shame around it for me. Like, I just was like, I felt so shameful that I'd kind of like hurt my best friend, and that, she'd stuck with me through all that. And embarrassed really that I couldn't be the person that I wanted to be for her. And I'm glad now in hindsight that we split up, because she's gone on to have a great career, and I don't speak to her anymore, but I'm sure she's happy, and I'm very, very happy in my life. But at that point, I wanted to drink. I was working in central London at the time, and every time I walked past the pub at night, I kept thinking to myself, I would just go in there, have a drink, and take this pain away. And again, it tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? I couldn't deal with the pain. And what my sponsor said to me at the time, which was fantastic, was, are you working the program? And I was quite annoyed at that question. I was like, how dare you? Am I working the program? Do you not see how many meetings I go to? Do you not see how many service positions I've got? And he said, no, the program. He said, the program is praying, meditating, taking inventory, sponsoring people. He said, are you doing any of those things? And I wasn't. I didn't have a relationship with a higher power. Like, I was giving, every morning I'd get on my knees and give lip service to something that I kind of believed in. Anyway, I did what was suggested, and I got down to praying correctly in my mind, which was actually sincerely having a conversation with a higher power of my own understanding. I learned to meditate, which was an absolute, just a revelation. To not, all I could do initially was sit for about 30 seconds. That was it. 2 minutes at the most, and a few years ago, I did a 10-day silent meditation retreat. So, to go from there to there in 10 years, it just shows the power of recovery. I started taking inventory every night. I send my inventory to my sponsor via a text message. And most importantly, I started to sponsor people, and that was the turning point in my recovery. Was handing it back, was giving what I'd been freely given. And once I started to do that, that was when my life totally transformed.
And I think, you make a good point in there that a lot of us in recovery, we go in, we ride that pink cloud for a little while, and then it's kind of like, okay, I've got this, and we get complacent. I spent 5 years being complacent, and I think continuously doing step groups saved my life, because there was times in there I'm like, what am I doing all this for? I mean, just to settle for a life that I'm not happy with. And so I actually, as a result of that complacency, as a result of people that cared about me enough to hurt my feelings and say, what are you doing? Or what are you not doing? I started doing the things that I did in early recovery, but just a little bit more seriously. And that ultimately led to me discovering my purpose and what I do today. And I know you do a lot of things, but when did you finally kind of discover your calling and, giving back to others, doing the podcast, the life coaching and all that kind of stuff?
Well, exactly the same thing that happened to you happened to me. So 5 years in, I was kind of, I was doing okay. I wasn't happy. I was doing all right. I was sober. I was single. I was living in a flat in London with a housemate that I didn't particularly like. I didn't like my job, and I decided that I was going to completely change my life, and I went to visit my friends in Italy, and they basically my good friend Massey just said to me, how about you come and live with us in Gran Canaria, because we're going to move to Gran Canaria. There'll be a room for you. You can just come out there. You can stay for as long as you like. You can get a job out there. You can work whatever you want to do. So I just thought, sod it, I'm going to do it. So I went back to the UK. I handed in my notice at work. I was earning a really good wage, working in sales. I'd been in sales for years. Hated it, absolutely hated it. Oh, and prior to that, sorry, I should also mention I was having panic attacks as well. So because the life I was leading didn't sit well with me on a spiritual level, I was full of fear. I was full of anxiety. I was taking painkillers. I was taking painkillers every day because I had a bad back, which I actually realized was just because of the stress. So anyway, I made this move and I went out to Gran Canaria. And just before I left, a good friend of mine who was a bit of an entrepreneur, she said to me, what's the 3 things that you would do if money was no object? So I said, making music, because obviously I've been a DJ for years and love music. I said painting, because I did a fine art degree and I'd always loved artwork. And I said, and helping people, those are the 3 things I'd do. And she said, well, follow those dreams when you're out there, just pursue those 3 things. So I said, okay, I will do. So, my higher power gave me absolutely everything that I needed, because I got out there and one of the first people that I met was a music producer. So we became friends, and we decided to make some music together. So, we went into his studio and made some music, and I enjoyed it, but I realized through doing that, it wasn't what I wanted to do as a career. At the same time, where that guy worked in the day was like a hostel. So I met all these cool people in this hostel who were all kind of holidaying and stuff. They were like the people hanging around with. And they had this lovely balcony where it overlooked the beach and the beautiful views and stuff. So I bought myself a load of art materials, easel, canvases, paints and everything. And I used to go up there during the day and just paint on the rooftop. Absolutely loved it. But again, I realized I didn't want to do it as a career. So I gave all these paintings to the people that I'd met, which was lovely. So I settled on the helping people. I was like, okay, so what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? How am I going to achieve this? So I contacted my parents and I said, like, I'm going to come back to the UK. I've decided that I think I'm going to go down the counselling route. I think I'm going to go back to university, train to be a counsellor or a therapist, and that's going to be the career that I'm going to follow. And my parents were a little bit like, well, how are you going to afford that? Like, you're going to get yourself in loads of debt again, and and all this kind of stuff. I'd only just paid off all my debt from my previous stint at university, and another higher power moment. All of a sudden, my mum emails me with an advertisement for a role as a trainee drug and alcohol counsellor in prisons in the UK. And the stipulation was you had to have a minimum of 3 years sobriety. And I was 4 years sober at the time. Yeah, it was 4 years. Yeah, not 5. And I was like, that's amazing. So I moved back to London, did the training, got the job. And then I worked as a drug and alcohol practitioner in prisons for about 3 years. And then from there, another higher power moment, I met my partner. And also, my partner's somebody that I've known since I was 12 years old. So Gran Canaria holds a special place in my heart, actually, because we met in Gran Canaria when we were on holiday. And we'd got back in touch via social media. And basically, she'd come down to see me in London. We'd got together, and I wanted to move up to live with near her in the Midlands. And all of a sudden, this job comes available in a prison in the Midlands. And the weird thing about it was that apparently no jobs had come available in that prison for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden, this job was available. So anyway, obviously, I took the job. It was an internal transfer. I got that job. And when I moved here, so that's where I live now, is in the Midlands in the UK. I just started writing my first book, and through the process of writing that book and then the series of books, I'd always had it in the back of my mind that I wanted to do a podcast. But I'm sure you can relate to, you just don't feel confident to do it, do you? I mean, especially when you first start, you're like, I hate the sound of my voice for a start. Do I really sound like that? And then you're like, I've not got the confidence to do this, all that stuff. It all comes up, doesn't it? But anyway, I'm really glad that I pursued it, and that's how I kind of got into where I am now, because the podcast has been running for a couple of years. The life coaching was kind of like the next step, really, because obviously my podcast was going further afield, and the next thing that happened was I was interviewing Dennis Berry, who became my life coach. So I was working with him, and he kept saying to me, "You'd be great at this. You should do this." And I was like, "Yeah, I kind of would, but I haven't got the time, and like it might be something that I'll do in the future." And then the pandemic hit, and when the pandemic hit, I was like, I'm stuck in every single night. Like I've got nothing to do other than go on Zoom meetings, go on the like kind of 12-step meetings. I can't do that every single night. So I did the life coaching qualification, and that's kind of where I'm at today. And one thing that I do want to mention, because this is quite a controversial thing, which you may or may not have heard about, or you may be interested in it. You may have even done it yourself. So 3 years ago, I was for my first book, I was researching traditional medicines, so ayahuasca, peyote, etc., and the person that introduced me to the idea of it was actually in 12-step fellowships. And my initial reaction was, as it says in the big book, contempt prior to investigation. I was like, not a chance, relapse all day long. Anyway, when I was researching it for the book, I started to understand that psychedelics aren't addictive, and also they deal with emotional trauma. And this was something that was quite interesting to me, because I'd already come to the realization that, as we've talked about, this is all about emotional intelligence. It's all about, being able to respond rather than react to your emotions. It's all about mental illness. And what I was reading was that these are actually medicines for the soul, really, So my partner and I split up. The relationship ended. And I didn't know whether it was the right decision. I was kind of like, I thought it was. And then a few weeks later, I thought to myself, I'm not sure about this. And I really needed to know, because it was either stay where I am in the Midlands and get back together and, you know, go on to do the things that we're doing now, like get married and have a baby and all that kind of stuff, or move back to where I was originally from, the rainy city. And I decided to go on this retreat, this ayahuasca retreat. And you know what, Tamar? It was actually the greatest spiritual experience that I've ever had in my life. It was completely and utterly revelatory. And that was what my third book was about. It was called Together an Ayahuasca Experience. And it just completely transformed my life, because for the first time ever, it totally made me realize that I was loved on a deep level by, you know, like all that insecurity that I'd had before. They don't like me, they don't really love me, all that kind of stuff, gone. It categorically helped me to understand that Adele is my twin flame, my soulmate, whatever you want to call it, and that we were meant to be together. Categorically helped me to understand that I wasn't meant to be with my ex-partner, and that we were on different paths, and that she didn't need any of this stuff. It was unbelievable. So from that, a couple of years later, I had a psilocybin experience with a friend that I met on that retreat, and again, that consolidated all this emotional stuff. So I have used psychedelics, and one of the main reasons why I did was because Bill Wilson did as well. Because Bill Wilson had experiences with LSD, and I uncovered that in my research. And you may or may not know this as well. You know, the 12 and 12, that was actually written by Bill and his sponsee Tom after they did their LSD sessions. And that is where that book came from. So it's very interesting. Once you've done psychedelics and you then read that book, you understand it on a much deeper level. So yeah, so that's something that I don't promote it. I don't go to meetings and say, look, everybody should be going and doing psychedelic. But what I do say is that for anybody who is really, really struggling with the spirituality of the program, and you know, they might be, like, let's say that they're new to recovery and they just can't get into the idea of God or a higher power. If you have one of those experiences, that would change fundamentally. You can't have one of those experiences and then say to people, there's no such thing as a higher power. It's impossible. Absolutely impossible. So that's kind of where I'm at, and where I'm at today, just in general with my recovery. And I mentioned this before we started recording. I've just done the steps again, or just started doing the steps again, and I'm doing it the Back to Basics program, which was originally kind of taken from how Dr. Bob used to take people through the steps, and he used to do it in a couple of days. So he'd usually do it in like a weekend retreat, and they'd kind of go through it hard, you know, steps 1 to 12 done. And I've done it very quickly. So I did steps 1, 2, and 3 in an hour. You know, I did step 4 in a couple of hours. Well, 3 or 4 hours. Obviously, me and my sponsor aren't in the same place, so we're doing it all via kind of social media and phone calls and stuff. And I'm doing my step 5 tonight, straight after this podcast. But just doing it in this new way, you know, and what we're looking at is, you know, the kind of the tone of this podcast is all about emotions, and what it was explained to me was get to the root, get to the causes and conditions. You know, what really annoys me, like one thing that really, really annoys me in recovery is when, and it is in the big book, so fair play, because people are just reciting what they hear, but people say alcohol is a symptom of the illness. It isn't a symptom of the illness. It's the medication for the illness. The symptom is not, like, drinking is not a symptom as far as I'm concerned. And the other thing that I don't agree with is it's not an allergy either, because I still drink mouthwash that has alcohol in it. And if I had an allergy to alcohol, I would be drinking, or I'd have an anaphylactic shock if I had an actual allergy to it, in the same way as peanuts, it would kill me. And it doesn't do that. And the reason why it doesn't do that is because you don't have an allergy to it. It's bad medicine, basically, that we're using to try to medicate ourselves. So I know that you absolutely agree and relate to what we're talking about when it comes to all this, but not everybody does. And I think, you know, it can become a little bit frustrating when you go to 12-step meetings and people are just reciting things from a book that was written in the 1930s. They didn't have all the information that we've got now. And not only that, but those people aren't necessarily going out and doing their own research. And you talked about neuroscience, like that. This book that I've written, another plug.
Yep, all is one.
This book, it talks a lot about that. It talks a lot about how science can explain spirituality and vice versa. A lot of the things that the great mystics of thousands of years ago were saying, science is now starting to prove. That all is one aspect. That is actually the truth. Everything is made of energy. Everything is made of consciousness. We're all manifesting from exactly the same thing. That's not mysticism. That's a scientific fact. So I think that, for me, I believe that recovery is beginning to evolve, I think, because I'm hearing more. I'm stepping away from, certain 12-step fellowships and certain belief systems and moving towards other belief systems, and still within the 12-step, program. But I gravitate towards people that are just much more open-minded and don't. If anybody says to me, all the answers that you need are in the first 164 pages of the big book, I just walk away from them, and I'll smile and shake their hand and be pleasant as pie. And I just think to myself, you're just delusional, like there's so much more on offer out there. So yeah, and as you know, I like to rant.
And I love that. And I mean, I feel like we could just chat about this subject for hours. Because you're right, there's so much more out there. And it's why I wrote my second book, Beyond Recovery, because I've created a life that I can be I'm fulfilled, I'm happy, I'm content. I'm willing to do the work every day to make myself just a little bit better, right, than before. But if I would have stayed stuck in that bubble of this is the way it is, this is all I'm going to do, I probably would have relapsed by now. And I think that being more open-minded and realizing that, hey, you know what, there is so much more outside of recovery than you could even imagine. That's what I'm super passionate about. So, what I want to be mindful, obviously, of time for you as well, because you could gotta go do a step 5. But, what motivates you today?
Well, the core of what motivates me on a personal level is being there for my family. Like I've become a very much a family man, and I think that it was another revelation to me to learn that I was actually capable of loving somebody else's children, because I've got 2 stepkids and I love them as though they're my own kids. And that relationship has deepened. I've known them for about 5 years, and I'm massively motivated by seeing that they're okay and helping them to get around the pitfalls of life, so to speak. And then all of a sudden, my daughter was born 15 months ago, and that was just this spiritual experience, this unbelievable gift that I've been given, because not only has it been a gift for me, but it's been a gift for the whole family, because like my dad now has got an opportunity to be there for this person, for his granddaughter, and he's amazing. Like my mum and my dad look after her 3 days a week, and they're absolutely unbelievable grandparents. I've got my partner's mum who also looks after our daughter as well, and she's unbelievable. So this little baby, she's just got all this love, and my partner, my partner's got many fantastic attributes, and I could sit here all day and sing her praises, but one of the things, apart from the fact that I was obviously very, very attracted to her and we're just like soulmates, it was just that I could tell what an amazing mother she is. And that I was like, if I'm going to have a child with anybody, it's going to be you, So that's kind of what motivates me, is to kind of ensure that my family has got the best life that they can have. And then on a professional level, I just try and keep it as simple as how can I help the people that are working for me? Because being a manager at work, I feel responsible for, for their happiness, I suppose, to a certain degree. And I don't mean that in a codependent way. I just mean that, at this moment in time, we've got a couple of people who that work for me that have got big issues going on, and I just want to be there for them. In the past, I didn't care. I just genuinely didn't care. I didn't care what was going on in other people's lives. I could sit there and smile and pretend that I cared. There was no empathy. There might have been a little bit of compassion, but there was no empathy. Whereas I can tell that I'm growing in empathy, because when the day is finished, I'm still thinking about those people. I'm putting myself in their shoes and thinking, God, that must be really tough for them, And that's completely different to how I operate. When I wake up in the morning, the first thing that I think about is me. And I think about myself all day long, like, oh, I want those trainers. How can I get more money for this? I need time to write my book. I need time to do my podcast. It's constantly like to step outside of that and be like, right, hang on a minute. What does everybody else need? Does my partner want a cup of tea? Does the ironing need doing? Does the cleaning need doing? Do the pots need emptying out of the dish? The dishes in the sink. All that stuff. It sounds to somebody who's not selfish, sounds ridiculous, but to somebody who's selfish, self-centered, and fearful, and dishonest, for all the reasons that, environmental and genetic or whatever, it's hard to change. It's hard to change. But I think that going through the steps, the way I'm doing it now, and what I'm going to continue doing, is just taking that time to stop, breathe, pray, speak to somebody, and think exactly about what I'm doing. Because the one thing that I think is key is knowing that there's a ripple effect. If I'm thinking about the way that I'm behaving, and I'm considering and responding to what's going on within me, rather than just reacting and running around like a headless chicken, everybody else around me is going to be feeling better. So that's kind of where I'm at, is just trying to think of others ahead of myself.
Yeah, and it's so true. I mean, I was the same way. I'm always thinking about myself. So I have to really make a concerted effort. And I think that's one of the gifts about being in the space that we're in with doing the podcast and the coaching, is you actually get to make your purpose about other people, right? And It's not just about ourselves anymore. So, John, if people want to learn more about you, get your books, I feel like we have to do a part 2 of this show, because there's so much more we could talk about. How can people get a hold of you?
If you just go to www.lifeinrecovery.co.uk, everything's on there. My books, my podcast, links to social media. And it's been a real pleasure having this conversation. So we'll definitely do it again sometime. I think it'd be really nice. I don't know if we didn't discuss this, but it'd be really nice if I can put it up on my podcast as well. And then, like you said, we'll do a part 2 as well.
Absolutely. That sounds like a great plan. But thank you for taking the time tonight. For you, I guess it's morning still for me.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate it.
Been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening. And if you've been affected by any of the issues discussed in the podcast, please see a range of mutual aid organisations in the show notes. Peace and love, and goodbye for now.